The Women's March, where ladies in vagina hats read poems about their period blood and complain that men aren't taking them more seriously. But if you crack through that hard outer shell of nasty girl shirts and anti-Semitism, you'll find a soft, gooey center filled with the tender love of all things Islamic.
In my household, there was no room for helpless. And at that time, I knew that things were about to get ugly and that nothing was going to change without a fight. And so I turned to the only inspiration that I knew, and that was the Holy Quran, the Word of God that was given to Prophet Muhammad.
Hearing a woman say that she turned to the Quran for inspiration is like hearing Abraham Lincoln say that he turned to John Wilkes Booth for inspiration. Speaking of U.S. presidents,
yes, the Quran, the same Quran that Thomas Jefferson used as a reference when he authored the Declaration of Independence.
you've got to love the logic here. When he was a law student, Thomas Jefferson bought a copy of George Sale's 2-volume translation of the Quran. Jefferson purchased the Quran so that he could understand the legal system of the Ottoman Empire, which was fighting periodic wars with Russia and various European nations. Now follow the logic. Jefferson bought a copy of the Quran when he was in law school. Therefore, when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, he must have used the Quran as a reference. There's no evidence that he used the Quran as a reference, but we'll declare that he did, because he had a copy. Sadly, that's about as airtight as arguments get at the Women's March. But they're not done yet, because if the Quran influenced Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, it probably influenced James Madison when he was writing the First Amendment to the United States Constitution.
And so is it surprising to you that our First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, free choice, and free will were all liberties that were awarded to humanity by God in the Quran 1400 years ago?
So, in whatever world Muslim feminists live in, the Quran gave humanity these First Amendment rights. Here on Planet Reality, however, it ain't like that. In the Quran, Allah repeatedly orders Muhammad and his followers to violently subjugate people who reject Islam. Allah orders Muslims to fight people who believe the wrong things, who say the wrong things, and who do the wrong things. Muhammad ordered Muslims to kill people for leaving Islam and to kill people for criticizing him. How, in the name of common sense, do you look at this endlessly swirling toilet of totalitarianism that just won't flush and say, this is just like the rights we find in the First Amendment? Does heading to the Women's March magically transport you to opposite world, where up is down and down is up, where left is right and right is left, where freedom is oppression and oppression is freedom? Speaking of opposite world.
And is it also surprising to know that the Quran is an avid supporter of women's rights? Woo! Women's rights. And get this, the Quran gave women rights equal to that of man. Equal. Really equal.
Equal rights for women in the Quran. Surah 4 verse 34 of the Quran says that Muslim men can beat their wives into submission. Are Muslim women allowed to beat their husbands into submission?
Equal. Really equal.
Surah 4 verse 3 of the Quran says that Muslim men can marry up to 4 wives. Are Muslim women allowed to marry up to 4 men?
Equal. Really equal.
Surah 2 verse 282 of the Quran says that the testimony of a woman is half as reliable as the testimony of a man. Is the testimony of a man also half as reliable as the testimony of a woman?
Equal. Really equal.
Surah 33, verse 59 of the Quran says that Muslim women have to wear a veil. Do Muslim men have to wear a veil?
Equal, really equal.
Surah 4, verse 24, Surah 23, verse 6, and Surah 70, verse 30 of the Quran say that Muslim men can have sex with their female captives and slave girls. Can Muslim women have sex with their male captives and slave boys?
Woo!
Whatever these westernized Muslim apologists mean by the word equality, it sounds an awful lot like what the rest of us mean by the word inequality. And the real world impact of the Quran's teachings is unmistakable. In 2009, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released a report on gender equality and social institutions. They rated countries around the world based on the opportunities women have for education or employment, laws to protect women from physical violence, the percentage of women who are married and or divorced by age 16, and so on. And they found that 11 of the 12 countries with the highest levels of discrimination against women were Muslim majority countries. A similar study in 2014 conducted by the World Economic Forum using their own criteria concluded that 18 of the 20 worst countries in the world in terms of the gender gap between men and women were Muslim majority countries. And this isn't some anomalous modern development. This systematic oppression goes back to the time of Muhammad. In Sahih al-Bukhari, 5825, Muhammad's child bride, Aisha, says, "I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women." And she says this in the context of Muslim men beating their wives into submission. In fact, she says it specifically in reference to a Muslim man beating his Muslim wife until her skin turned green. No one in history was in a better position to see the real impact Muhammad's teachings had on women than Aisha. Aisha's assessment was that Muslim women were treated worse than any other women. Why? Because Muslim men had justification from Allah Himself to oppress women. Here we are 14 centuries later, and things haven't changed. The worst places in the world to be a woman are Muslim countries. And what do we hear at the Women's March?
And women in the 7th century enjoyed liberties that many women don't have today. And so I can't help but wonder, is modernity taking us forward or is it taking us backwards?
Now, think about this. The Quran is the greatest source of misogyny and oppression the world has ever seen. The speakers at the Women's March victimhood pageant had the media's eye and ear. The speakers had an unparalleled opportunity to call attention to the honor killings and female genital mutilation and wife beating and child marriages and forced marriages that are so prevalent in Muslim countries. But instead of doing something to help the victims of these practices, who frequently can't speak out for themselves, they chose to embrace the oppressors and actively promote Muhammad and the Quran. This tells me that when the leaders of the Women's March got together and said, "We're going to have a rally and make a difference for women," they meant no such thing. The Women's March isn't about helping women. It's about taking a handful of extremist political positions that most women would never accept and wrapping them up in feminist jargon with a pretty pink bow in order to convince women that these extremist positions are somehow essential to women's progress and that anyone who opposes these extremist positions is anti-women. We see this pattern just about everywhere nowadays. The primary task for proponents of certain extremist ideologies in the 21st century is to build a massive mob. If you can build a big enough mob, you can shout down everyone who disagrees with you, and you no longer need to make a rational case for your irrational position. If you can build a mob out of an entire gender, you can silence just about anyone. Fortunately, the speakers and leaders at the Women's March got too extreme and too stupid too quickly, and women started realizing that they were being manipulated. But the failure of the Women's March to do anything to help oppressed women in Muslim countries leaves that task for people who care more about women than they care about their personal agendas. For those of you who want to help victims of Islamic spousal abuse and Islamic honor killings and Islamic female genital mutilation, I suggest you start by exposing the nonsense that so-called feminists are saying about Muhammad and the Quran. People can't deal with a problem when they don't see a problem. If you'd like to show them the problem, here are a few videos that deal with some of the core issues. Learn the material, learn it well, pass it on, and be part of a revolution that goes beyond vagina hats and nasty girl shirts.